I just fell in love with engineering, programming, etc. But Apple was one of those companies that I just always wanted to go work for.
Let's bring in Phillip Shoemaker.
Was the guy that created the App Store for Apple.
Now advises developers who want to get their apps into the App Store.
He is the CEO and executive director of identity.com.
But when David Copperfield outed me by a tweet, my life changed. And that's when I realized that digital identity was the future. I'm sitting in my office waiting for a phone call, and it lights up and says Office of Steve Jobs. And at that point, I was just like, oh, I'm done. I'm going to get fired right now.
So I'm very excited to have Phillip Shoemaker in the studio with me today. Phillip has a very, very long, extensive background in Silicon Valley, a whole bunch of startups, big companies, in particular Apple, where he built the App Store review process for apps, over a decade ago. And so I'm excited to hear some of the stories. Steve Jobs himself actually interviewed and hired Phillip. So we're going to dive into some of those anecdotes of what happened and working with Steve and how that was like. But just to kick it off, thank you for being here. And I would love for you to give the audience a quick background about yourself, where you're from, and we can dive in after that.
All right. Sounds good. Yeah. So obviously we've known each other for a long time, but years ago, I was fortunate enough to be born and raised in Silicon Valley, right? Very lucky. My dad was an executive at IBM. And so I was raised in Cupertino, and right down the street was Apple. And I always wanted to go there, right? I always wanted to work at Apple, always wanted to get a Mac or an Apple II at the time. And my father bought 7 shares of IBM stock for me when I was born. And it split twice. So when I was 16, I had 28 shares of IBM stock. That was like $3,000. I figured out how to sell it and ultimately get the cash. And when I was 16, I went down to the little store in Cupertino, and I bought an Apple II, and I brought it home. Now, remember, my dad's an executive at IBM. He walked in the door a couple hours later, and he just looked at me and said, "Pack it up." And we packed it up, brought it back to the store, returned it, and then got an IBM PC, because those were real computers, right? According to my dad. And so that was kind of my journey into this space. And I just fell in love with engineering, programming, et cetera, and playing around. But Apple was one of those companies that I just always wanted to go work for, right? And after being at a bunch of startups in my life, companies like Symantec, when they were just starting out, Actuate, Palm Computing, I ultimately made it to Apple to build and run the App Store, right? To focus on that. But that was 2009 when I got hired there. So I spent a majority of my career working at other startups, doing some really cool AI type stuff as well. And then I landed at Apple, which was a 4-month interview process, right? The longest I'd ever interviewed for a job. I didn't really want it in the beginning. I had left the AI startup Numenta. I wanted to play around with iPhone and developing for the iPhone, created a bunch of just bad apps. But I wanted to see how to get them into the store, and that was just a nightmare process. So I kept writing in emails about how flawed their process was, why they're nickel and diming me. That's what I call it. Imagine if somebody's reviewing your resume, and once they find the very first spelling or error, they circle it and they send it back to you. They don't look at the rest of it. That's how app review was in the early days. There were maybe 4 people working there. And so I did that for a while, and I just was getting angrier and angrier. And then Eddie Q called me up and said, "Hey, we've seen your emails. Why don't you come interview for a job here?" And that started this 4-month process. It was insane to go work there.
Oh, that's great. I mean, so you get this email from Apple. How did you feel in the moment the email hit the box from Eddie Q?
Well, that was interesting because honestly, I love the Apple platform. I love the iPhone, but I wouldn't say I was a typical Apple fanboy, right? I didn't know who the hell this guy was, who Eddie Q was at the time. And when I looked into it, it's like, oh, yeah, he's kind of important there, right? He reports directly to Steve. He started out in the IT department, but Eddie built himself an empire. And so once I understood who it was that wanted to meet with me, oh, yeah, it was a bit of fear. But to me, it's excitement. Job interviews are always kind of exciting because you got nothing to lose, right? if you don't get the job, you don't get the job. It's not like you're getting fired,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're just not getting the job. So for me, I went in there. I walked into IL1, Infinite Loop 1, which was the main campus at the time. And there's Eddie sitting on a couch just in the lobby, and we sat there for an hour. His typical, he was slouching down, his feet up on a table as we were chatting, and we had a wonderful chat. And then
You got interviewed in the lounge of.
I was interviewed in the lounge
Wow.
of Infinite Loop 1, yeah.
Okay. So when did you meet Steve Jobs in this process?
That was my final day of interviews. Now
Okay.
this was 3.5 months down the road.
2009-ish.
Yeah,
So he was.
This
I mean,
was-
he was like there was the return of Steve Jobs in full swing.
That's
the
right.
iPhone had just launched, a couple of years back.
yeah.
And he's obviously a legend. Was the legend of Silicon Valley.
Oh,
How did it feel?
it was terrifying, and it was one of those things that I didn't know what I was doing. I walked into this. I knew there was one more interview, but they didn't tell me who it was with, and so I get walked up to what I now know as the boardroom, and I walk in, and the entire table is full of people, and right in the center was Steve, but flanking him on either side were his executives, every exec in the company, minus Tim. Tim wasn't there. I mean, it was all software related and hardware related. So Scott Forstall was there, Greg Joswick, Phil Schiller. They were all sitting at the table, and in front of me were two phones, and they said, "Hey, have a seat. We want you to review some apps," which made no sense. I didn't know what the review guidelines were. I didn't know what the policies were, but they wanted to see if I could turn on these phones, go through an app, and explain my thought process, what I think should be allowed, what shouldn't be allowed. And it started out that way. There were no introductions. I knew exactly that was Steve sitting across from me. I mean, he was right across from me. And then we just started to debate the apps. Like, why is this one not allowed? And then somebody would throw out something that's like, well, what about this? Did you look at this? There's violence in the app. And I'd argue with that, talking about how this is cartoon violence. It should be handled differently. And it was one of those things that I had nothing to lose. So I gave it as good as I got it. Just this debate back and forth. Steve would fire questions. Phil would fire questions. I'd answer them just right back. I had no problem speaking my mind in front of these guys, regardless of how important they were in the world. It was just, to me, it was fun. It was one of the most interesting interviews I'd ever had.
Great. So when you left there, what did you feel? Were you excited? Do you think you got it?
When I left there, there was a pivotal interview earlier on the week
Okay.
before, but this one I knew at this point that I had it, right, because there was nothing I said that could be misconstrued. I spoke my mind. I was worried that maybe I was a little too forceful in my answers back, but when somebody comes at you with extreme force, you gotta return the same, right? Otherwise, you're getting walked over. So for me, it was a tough interview, but yeah, I figured I had it at that point.
Okay. Well, so you leave this interview with Steve Jobs. How long did it make you wait until they send you an offer?
Yeah, so they made me an offer about 3 weeks later, and then I started. My first day was March 9th, 2009. And I was brought in, onboarded like everybody else. And it was interesting because it was a big group of people coming on that day. You're all given T-shirts that say the date you come on board. And it turned out that more than half of this group, there's probably 40 people there, more than half were going to be working ultimately for me.
Oh, wow.
And we were just trying to hire as many people as we could as fast as possible because demand, the apps that were being submitted were just off the hook. I mean, it was when the store opened, they expected they might get 20, 30 apps the day it opened. And instead they got 500. And that kind of blew them away. They were a little shocked. And those 500 kept coming every week, another 500 apps. And that just climbed. By the time I got there, it was about 2,500 apps per week.
New
And then
apps.
new apps.
Oh, wow.
And then it just climbed from there. When I left in 2016, it was about 100,000 apps per week. Now, this is a combination of new and updates. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So you're at the Apple campus,
Yeah.
and you've just got this new job to build out this App Store review process. What would you say was like the most challenging part of the job, especially in the beginning? How did you tackle this? Because you've never done this before. You're
Right.
walking in from
That's right.
scratch.
Yeah, for me, it was all trying to figure out where I needed to optimize the process. Clearly, I wrote so many emails in there. I knew what a lot of the problems were because they weren't responding fast enough. It took 2 to 3 weeks to get even a rejection out of Apple. These were things that in the day and age, and if you think about it, 2009, uh, Web 2 was strong during that point. People were creating great things, and it was release early, release often. That was the mentality of websites. You don't need to go through a review process to get your website pushed out. But here we were introducing something that we hadn't seen since commercial software, which was you had to create a golden master, right? You basically have to submit it and then don't touch the code for a few weeks while Apple reviews it and then come back and review it. So there were all these optimizations we had to do. So the very first thing I did, and I have a copy of this, is I wrote down all the ways that developers could sneak stuff past the review team. Now these are cookies things like Easter eggs. There's cookies. There's what we call a remote trigger. There were all these things I invented out of my head saying, okay, if I wanted to sneak stuff through this team, how would I do it? And I wrote down a list of them. And as I would run across an app that did that, I would check it off later in life. But yeah, that was the first thing I did. It's like, okay, we got to create a process that disallows this. Because if you think about what we were doing, 98% of the developers submitting apps to the store were trying to just create apps. 2% were trying to pull one over on you, right? They were trying to steal some data from users. They were trying to get some money from people. They were trying to get their PII. All of this stuff was a problem. And so I wanted to be able to prevent that. So we engineered this whole process to protect our customers from that 2%.
So, Philip, in your first month at Apple, did you have any interactions with Steve Jobs, and what happened?
Yeah, well, yes, there was one interaction. For the most part, Steve was somebody that, as we know in hindsight now, he was going through some medical issues at the time.
Yeah.
So he wasn't in the office a lot, but he kept his thumb on the pulse of what was going on at Apple. And I'll never forget this one day. I was 3 weeks on the job. I was driving into the office, and there were people picketing outside of Infinite Loop. Now, I'd never seen this before. And I couldn't make out what they were what they were saying on the thing, but I remember driving in, and as I was getting into the parking lot, my phone rings from, this is a phone number I'll never forget, 408-996-1010. That's Apple's corporate number. And so if you get a call from that, Apple corporate is calling you, and it was the PR team. And they said, "What did you do?" And it's like, "What? I did nothing. What do you mean? I'm just driving into the office." And so I came into the office and I found out that the team had approved an app called Baby Shaker. And now it's a very innocuous app. It was just a drawing of a baby. And when you launch the app, the baby is quiet. But if it starts crying, you slowly rock your hand, and because it uses the accelerometer.
Shoot. I know where this is going.
And it works fine, right? But if you shake the heck out of it, X's go over the baby's eyes, and then it says never shake a baby, and that's it. It was pretty painless of an app if you think about it. But the whole babies dying part was really in poor taste.
Yeah.
And my team approved it. Now this was a team we had no guidelines. We were making stuff up as we went, and this went through 3 sets of eyes. 3 different people saw this app, said it's fine, and pushed it to the store. And I tell you, that was on a Tuesday. Apple had announced their earnings that morning, and they were record earnings. Eddie Q announced, I think, a millionth download on the App Store, so that was record news. And our stock price went down. It went down because of this darn app. And so I go into the office and I start tracking down what's going on, trying to figure out who did this. And I'm sitting in my office waiting for a phone call, and it lights up and says Office of Steve Jobs.
Great.
And at that point, I was just like, "Oh, I'm done. I'm going to get fired right now because of something my team did, right?" And you know how it is.
Yeah.
The buck stops with you, right?
Yeah.
It's not with the team members. And so I picked up the phone, and it was his admin, and she said, "Hey, Philip, Steve wants to have a word with you." I was like, "Fine." And so I wait. And he gets on the phone, and this is Steve, right? He just says, "You're stupid, and you hire stupid people," and he slams the phone. And I'm left holding the phone in my ear. It's like, do I still work here? So I got up and went and talked to my boss, and he's like, yeah, that's Steve. Don't worry about it. Like, don't worry about it. That's Steve's telling me that. And so, but look, I think what I learned there is that absolutely the buck stops with me.
Yeah.
There should it,
Well, that's
it-
leadership, right?
that's leadership.
Leadership is basically taking responsibility, because you're responsible for the successes and failures of your team.
Right.
But the glory of the successes go to your team, and I would say the shame of failures sits on your shoulders.
That's right. That's right. But we've all had those managers that wanted to take your successes as an employee
Yeah.
and champion them, and all the failures throw
And
them on
those
your
are the
back.
worst leaders in
They're the
business.
worst leaders. Yeah. And so this was one of those things. I ended up spending the next few days talking to the team members that reviewed the app. The first one was a Brazilian national. So she had come over and she didn't understand that X's on the eyes meant death. To her, this was innocuous. The other one was was a Canadian who said, I didn't even see the X's on the eyes because I didn't shake the phone hard. And then third was a longtime guy from developer tech support who was like, he has no kids. He was like, what do I care? And so it was one of these things that that the HR came to me and management came to me and said, you got to fire him.
Yeah.
You got to fire these people. And that's when I was like, I'm 3 weeks on the job. I can't fire people for this. This was an honest mistake. And so I went into him and I was like, look, if you want to fire someone, fire me. I'm not going to tell you who the reviewers were that did this. They ultimately figured out who it was. Nobody got fired, fortunately, because I think it's part of the learning experience.
part of
You're going to
learning.
make mistakes. And you can't penalize people for making mistakes.
I think
especially.
firing anyone for a first-time offense, is there are exceptions to that, fraud, theft,
Absolutely.
breaking the law, things like that. But for just genuine, honest mistakes, it's not like it doesn't show well as a leader.
No.
Okay, you have to actually have some compassion and you have to have some empathy for your team and understand what they went through or what they had to go through.
That's right.
And you have to give people a warning. I think it's fair to warn people and say, look, this is the level we expect at the company. This is what your output should be. And in this instance, you fell below that level.
Yeah.
And if it happens again, you're gone. And that's fair. So a first time offense firing for me, I think it's, you actually lose some really good people. I've had really good people in my career where they screwed up, and I gave them a very stern warning, and then they became one of the best people I've worked with because it's part of the learning process for them to understand what the expectations are.
Yeah, it's funny. I look back at just simple things that happen to me in I believe that things that happen to you in your childhood often come through in adulthood as you're leading, et cetera. And I remember as a kid, if we broke a dish in our household, I mean, there was hell to pay. Even if it was accidental, your brother tripped you and you dropped the plate or something like that, you'd get in trouble for this. And I remember as an adult, when my child broke something, you don't make them get in trouble for that because it's an accident, right? When accidents happen, when mistakes happen, that's one thing. Now, if they're running around throwing dishes at each other and catching them,
Being
that's another
irresponsible,
thing, being irresponsible. But when somebody's doing something in the straight up course of their job and they make a mistake, you can't fire them.
Okay, so you got through the first 3 weeks. This happened.
Yeah.
What else happens next?
Well, it was interesting. Later on that same day, I got a call from the office of Al Gore.
Okay.
And it's just like, I hearken back to that movie Office Space with the TPS reports. It's like, how many people are going to call me and tear me a new one because of this baby shaker app? Al Gore was actually easy. That was an easy one to handle. And he was
So
a
Al
great
Gore
guy.
called you because of this baby shaker app.
He did, yeah.
In what capacity?
He wanted to know, how did we let this slip through?
Well, I'm saying, what capacity was he at?
Oh, so Al was on the board.
The board
at
of
the
Apple,
time.
okay.
He was on the board of Apple, and I was thinking, is this really going to go to every board member? Who's next, right? I didn't know any of the board members other than I knew who Al Gore was.
Yeah.
And so he wanted to know about the process, and he wanted me to meet with one of his experts to talk through the process, and I did that. It was pretty innocuous, but for me, it was just a sign that we're in the big leagues, right? You can't make these kind of mistakes.
That was part of the the mega rise of Apple at that
That's
point.
right.
Okay, so what happens next at Apple? Like, so you're building this review store, you're scaling up the team. How many people did you had a few in the beginning, and how quickly and how big did you scale the team to?
Well, it's interesting. There were people at Apple that were furious hearing my name because I was getting all the wrecks that everybody was getting. You know, if you think about 2009, we're still dealing with the 2008 blow-up financial crisis. Apple wasn't hiring massive amounts of people, but every time more recs got open, they usually went to me and my team. Because right then, it was about a 3-week review time. You'd submit your app, and you'd either get approved or rejected in 3 weeks' time. Imagine.
And I remember we had like I had an app company a little bit later, but we had like this. We could expedite like once a year or twice a year or something if you had a major bug or something.
Yes, the expedites came it came
Later.
a couple of years later.
Okay.
And in the beginning, it was just submit your app. So people would submit their app, wait 2 weeks, and they're like, oh my gosh, I found a critical bug. And they'd pull it out of review and put it back in, thinking it's going to be in the same place, but it's FIFO, right? First in, first out. And so we ran them in that. It's not like we're reviewing the apps for 3 weeks. It was just we had too few people. We couldn't get enough reviewers on there to look at the apps in time. So they'd sit for 3 weeks in a queue, waiting for someone to pull it out, review it, reject it, and approve it. So clearly we needed to hire people. And so when I joined, there were 4 people. They were in a little conference room that was doubly walled off. There were curtains, so you couldn't even open the door and see inside of it if somebody came sneaking by. And that was the beginning. We did training. You know, if you think about my first week, I said, I want to be trained just like every other reviewer. I want to go through this process. I literally sat in a room with 2 people and they walked me through everything. That was the review. That was the training process. And that was for new hires as well. Now, when I left, we had a training room. We had 40 people in there at a time. We could train them all up and get them going really quickly with all the equipment. But in the early days, it was just pretty rudimentary stuff. And so it was very difficult to onboard people. It was difficult to find the right kind of person for this job. So we started just pilfering from the Apple stores. We want a genius, get an Apple genius. They know the brand. They know what they can and can't say.
They're already in the company.
They're in the company. They look, Apple, the folks that work at the Apple stores tend to have more, you know, they bleed rainbow, we used to say. They just had so much love of Apple. They drank the Kool-Aid. They stayed there. So those were the kind of people we hired because we knew they'd be lifers. They'd come and stay for as long as we wanted.
That's awesome. Okay, so I want to hear some more Steve Jobs stories. Do you have any more for me?
Yeah,
you know, selfish of it. I like the Steve Jobs anecdotes.
Steve was, you know, he was an interesting character, and I'd see him walk through all the time. And you know, one of the first things that Jaws told me, Greg Jaws, who's now executive vice president of worldwide marketing, Jaws said, Philip, there's one rock star at this company, and his name's Steve. None of us have an ego. You can't have an ego and work here. So, you know, don't be on social media. Don't talk about stuff. Just stay quiet. And so that was one of the earliest things I heard. But he also said at the same time, you need to have your elevator pitch. I was like, I'm not starting a company. What do you mean? He goes, no, for what you do for this company. Because if you run into Steve and you're in an elevator with him, he will ask you this question. And more often than not, people get fired from those little interactions with Steve.
Really?
If you can't describe what you can do in an elevator with Steve, then what good are you in this company? Right?
Yeah, I'd probably take the stairs.
I took stairs many times. You know, and plus it was only 3 floors. Why are you really taking the elevator anyway? But yeah, so everybody I knew had their elevator pitch memorized for telling Steve what they were going to do or what they do for a living. So, but you know, my main interaction with Steve was mainly through email and phone calls, where one of his friends got their app rejected. Somebody at Amazon got a notice that he didn't like, and he wanted us to follow through on it. Those were a lot of things. But one of the biggest things, you asked me what I did my first week at Apple. One of the first things I wrote is we need guidelines. Right now, developers were submitting apps based on what they saw in the App Store and what they didn't see, right? How many people submitted apps of pornography in that first 2 years was mind-blowing. Because everybody would look at the App Store and they're like, do you know what the App Store is missing? It's missing a good porn app. And so everybody would write these porn apps. They'd come on to the review team. Now, my review team saw some of the most horrific things. And we were rejecting upwards of 80% of apps coming into the store. And my team told me that they said it's all porn apps. And I was like, I don't believe you. I don't believe you. 80% of apps are porn apps. Are you kidding me? And so I said, start sending me. I want to start seeing some of this. Show me the content that you're calling porn. And I shut that down, that request, after 2 days of my inbox filling with the most vile stuff you've ever seen. All that's in an app. And they're doing screenshots and sending them to me over email, which HR and IT must have loved, all the porn going into my inbox. And at that point, I went down. I was like, yeah, you're right. It's not, this is bad stuff. And so it just reinforced the idea that we need guidelines. People can't look at the store and figure out what's allowed and what's not allowed, because the other problem with that, the other side of the coin, is that the app review team makes errors around 15%. Right? If you think about that, 15% of all apps in the App Store shouldn't be there. So if people are looking at the App Store for what's allowed, they're going to run into a lot of mistakes. And so that was the other side of the coin, was that what you see in the store is not necessarily what we allow. And so developers would always come and say, well, so-and-so does it. And we're like, thank you for telling us. And we'd pull that off the store. It was called Under the Bus, right? We had a whole process called UTB. And we'd pull them out of the store because developer X outed them. And so it was a lot of that. So when we had time to finally sit down, when Steve said, you're right, we need guidelines, that was about 1.5 years into the process. We sat down and went through. I had a wiki. My team had created a wiki of everything we've allowed and everything we've disallowed and reasons why. And so we just went through that big database, essentially a big wiki, and put together some guidelines. So we sat side by side working on those together. And that's where you see his absolute brilliance. He could look at a bunch of information on a page and say, well, look, that's all nonsense. It's all related. Let's just write this one line to refer to all of these things. He could just whittle down so much data into just one line that it really blew my mind. But look, these were long sessions. I mean, like 10, 15 hours going through at a time, going through these things. It was intense. And that's the main way I would describe Steve is he was just intense, always. I never got the side of him, the personal side. I wasn't buddies with him. I never saw what he was like as a human. I saw what he was like as a leader and a very charismatic leader at the company, and it was just phenomenal.
Yeah, I think everyone who watched it from afar probably had the same perspective. Like, he oozed charisma from his first couple early talks, and then I remember watching an old video of him. I think with Next. You're sitting with a team trying to they were doing some sort of project planning for their product before it got rolled into Apple, and he's just very, very charismatic.
Absolutely,
even those days. Okay, so let's go through the journey at Apple. So you spent 6-7 years there.
7 years, yeah.
Okay, so you started off with 4 people on your team. What did you end up at?
It was over 400 people.
Okay,
right. So we just hired constantly. And new things would get introduced to us, right? First of all, there's this meeting that we used to have once a month called the Executive Review Board, and that was a meeting that originally had Steve and most of his direct reports that had something to do with software. So Scott Forstall was there, Jaws, Phil Schiller, all those folks, and we would sit down and go through all the apps. And my team, largely me, right? The team would say, we're not going to approve these apps. We're not sure to do with these apps. And I'd come in and I would say, okay, approve this, reject this. And then I'd find something that's like, I don't know what to do about this, right? And I'd bring those to the Executive Review Board. And it was in that first week, I had that meeting, my first week on the job. I said, how often do we have this meeting? They said, once a month. And it's a painful 4-hour meeting with all the executives who yell at you and argue with you constantly. It's like, we need to do this every week. I mean, I've got a team now that's trying to review apps for the you want to know why it's 3 weeks in review time? Because we meet once a month to deal with some of these hard issues, and that's going to push them out at least 4 weeks. And so it's like, we need to do this weekly. Even though I knew it was going to be difficult for my team to put this deck together, and it was going to be difficult for me to have to deal with a 4-hour meeting every week. But the fact that all the executives, right, these are high-paid folks that have a lot to do. They all agreed to meet once a week to go over this. Just blew my mind. So we started doing that. Now, Steve stopped showing up. Right? He wasn't about to do a 4-hour meeting every week. But so he stopped showing up. But that's where we really started digging in I bring them the financials. I talk about how many apps we reviewed, all the metrics, but I also bring them the actual hard apps to be able to go through, and we'd debate, and we'd argue, and we'd fight. And there was this one time where a developer sent us an app, and in the app it says, okay, to get it was basically a robotic cockroach, is what they said. And it was just a very strange thing. It's like, okay, and it says, in order to get your cockroach, enter your address here. So we entered our address as a review team. They sent us a live cockroach, and it was a big sucker with all the hardware. And you take the instructions on how to feed the wires into its head, and the double stick tape to put this little processor on its back. And you literally, using this app, could go left, left, right, right, and the cockroach would move left, left.
You kidding
right,
me?
right.
This is nuts.
It was amazing, right?
This is like Neuralink back in the days.
It was like Neuralink, exactly. And you could control it for about an hour. And then neuroplasticity, the cockroach rewires its brain in a way, and it just leaves with your wires and your processor, and your cockroach is gone. But I remember I was like, there is no way we're going to approve this app, right? This is, look, I love science and all, but this is still a living being.
Yeah.
And it's a slippery slope. Would we allow you to do this to your dog and your cat? Probably not, but a cockroach is okay. And I said, I went to the executive review board. I was like, look, I think we should reject it. And I almost got drummed out of the room, especially by Phil Schiller, executive of marketing. He said, oh, so science is going to lose because your feelings are hurt. It's like, no, PETA will be picketing outside of Apple as soon as we release this. And I remember the argument was PETA would not picket because that's not an animal. A cockroach isn't an animal, which it is, right? It is an animal. Yeah. He's like, it's not warm-blooded. And I was like, well, that's a mammal. Okay, fine. So we decided not to allow it. A few weeks later, it came back through. One of my reviewers approved it.
Oh, boy.
Which they shouldn't have. We had a database of what apps we should approve or shouldn't approve. We saw that it had been rejected previously. Somebody approved it. PETA was there the next day picking it. And we had to pull it off the store. The hardest thing we always had to do was pulling an app off the store. That's the last thing you want because it bloodies your nose twice, right? It bloodies you should not have approved it, and now you're pulling it off. Oh, you're a big
And just because
jerk.
it's pulled off the app store doesn't mean it's removed from people's devices either.
Yeah. Apple still has no way of pulling an app off a device.
Yeah.
So if you download an app that's forbidden, you can run it forever.
Yeah. I know there's a secondary market for people who have Fortnite.
That's
on
right.
On the apps before the whole Fortnite lawsuit came down.
It's crazy.
Okay, so this is interesting. So, okay, while we're on the topic of apps, I mean, for people listening who are building an app, thinking of building an app, trying to get an app business going, what advice do you have for them if they get rejected by the App Store review, and how do you get your app into the App Store?
Yeah, the first thing I say, so Apple will always say that there's no pre-review process, right? But if you have a concept that you don't think Apple's going to approve or you just don't know, there are things you can do. But the first thing I would recommend people do is read the guidelines, right? We spend a lot of time on those guidelines to make sure that people know what's allowed and what's not allowed. Now, having said that, most of the guidelines are gray, right? They're not clear, black and white. It's pretty gray. And so just read those. If you need more information, something nobody ever does is read the program license agreement. It's all legalese, it's big, but there's a whole section all about what we allow and what we don't allow. It goes into more detail than the guidelines do. The guidelines are user-friendly, the PLA is not, right? So the license agreement, I recommend you read both of those before you decide to work on a porn app or anything that's controversial. Because that's just sunk time, right? Because if you do that, it'll never go in the store regardless how much you complain. Now, if you're looking at one of those guidelines and you see it as gray and you're pushing a little bit over the line, those are the ones that are ripe for the picking. Those are the ones that can really get you introduced to a huge audience at Apple in the App Store, and that Apple might allow. And so there's certain ways, right? Oftentimes a developer submits an app like that steps over these lines, and Apple just rejects it outright because the reviewer interprets it differently than maybe I would. So if you get your first rejection and you don't agree with it, you can always respond directly there in the comments. Now, what that does is that goes back into the queue of that same reviewer to respond to those comments. So as you have a back and forth exchange, you're still talking to the person that rejected your app, right? And so oftentimes it falls on deaf ears. You can say that this will save humanity, reduce global climate change, et cetera. And it doesn't matter. The reviewer has blinders on, will say, no, no, no. So you can have that back and forth. If you think it's a simple misunderstanding, that's fine. But if you find that reviewer is being obstinate, they're not gonna change their mind. There's something called the ARB, and that's the App Review Board. Now, the ARB is if you want to, you can go into the App Store into iTunes Connect now, or App Store Connect, it's called now. There's a place that you can say, I want to appeal this, right? It's the appeal board, and you can write your appeal there. Now, what that does, when I was there, that went to a group of my managers, right? So it's a higher level, just literally one higher level than the reviewers, to review those apps, and they'd bring them through, and oftentimes they would just say, nope, the reviewer was right, and they do it. So again, they had a lot of the blinders on. Oftentimes what would happen is they would go from that, ones that that made it through the appeal would come to me, I'd agree with it or not, or I'd send it to the execs. And so there's this appeal process. The problem right now is I understand that the appeal process goes to the same people that reviewed your app. It's not those managers anymore, it's a bunch of reviewers. And that's always going to be a problem because the reviewers know the guidelines extremely well, but they don't understand the intent behind the guideline. And intent is what matters here because the guidelines are written in a way that are so black, they're not black and white, they're so gray, it's super subjective. And if you wrote the guidelines or were involved in the guidelines, then you might have a better understanding. And I used to hold weekly meetings when I was at Apple to talk to the reviewers about this is what the intent is of 1.3.4 or something like that, right? These guidelines. And we spend a lot of time that. Now, so I'm saying the ARB, the appeal process, doesn't work so great anymore. So I have a new process that I do. And this one is a little more painful, but it tends to work really well. And that is you send an email to the App Store Connect. It's basically it's something like app reviewers at apple.com, something like that. Then you copy Tim Cook, you copy Phil Schiller. I would eliminate Phil now and do Jaws instead, and Matt Fisher. Right, these are all guys, all executives at Apple that are in control of this process. And you send them an email, and you do a quick executive plea. Keep it a short summary. Give them the app name. Give them the app ID. That's the numbers behind. When you look in the store, you can see the numbers. Or when you're on the when you're in App Store Connect, you can see these numbers. It's the Apple ID, we call it. Give them that as well because that's a unique number. They can look it up, and then explain very concisely what the problem is, right, and why you believe it should be allowed. And then you can give all the other data, right? If you have VCs, you have famous or popular venture capitalists that are friends with Apple, if they have comments there, they can put them there. Put all that other data below it. Just give them the summary. Now, the key here is the time you send it, right? So I told you guys earlier about the executive review board. That's every Friday at 10 a.m. So you want to get it into their hands before they go into that meeting. So ideally, you send something out late Thursday night, Pacific time, late Thursday night, 10, 11, 12. And it'll be one of the first emails that the team sees in the morning when they go into the executive review board. They'll see those emails, and then they'll walk into a meeting where it's discussed, right? So you've appealed the decision. So you go through that appeal process. That means it's going to go to the ERB. And then you get these executives that sit on the ERB to think about your app as they're walking into the meeting that day. And it tends to have a really good...
That's powerful. Thank you.
Yeah, it works really well.
Okay, that's a great tip. Something you said early on, it caught my attention. This gray area in the guidelines. It sounds like it's basically an open field for coming up with business ideas.
Yeah. Oh, it absolutely is.
So if you're thinking about building an app, you should go through the guidelines and see what are the areas that are not well defined, where there's a market opportunity that's not being well served.
100%. Totally agree with that because it's one of those areas where developers can push the envelope a little bit. And that's how, look, to be honest, the guidelines haven't changed in a substantial way for 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
It's disappointing. They haven't expanded the type of apps. I mean, look, even crypto apps are hamstrung in the store, and apps like that. Those are things that they should have expanded on by now. Now, there's three ways to expand guidelines. The guidelines. One is that Android supports it. Right? That's almost a surefire way for Apple to say, okay, maybe we need to allow this because Google supports it. Because, look, regardless of what people say, there's still competition there. They're still worried about numbers, who has the most apps in the store. Two, Apple's releasing a new set of APIs or something, so they're going to expand the guidelines to support those new APIs. And three, a developer puts out something really compelling that the executives say, wow, this is too cool. We got to allow this through. And that happened with something like Siri, right? Siri was originally an app in the App Store, which Apple saw and said, you know what, let's pull this off the store. Let's ultimately buy this technology. And that happened really fast. I had to hide that app. I didn't know why. And then next thing you know, we acquired the company. Stuff like that happens, especially when these guidelines are pushed a little bit. Now, having said that, the one guideline you never push is how you pay. Right, we saw Epic learned that lesson.
Yeah,
right. All these developers have learned that lesson about
Apple Store tax.
That's right. That 30%.
Which I'm in two minds about this. The whole Epic thing is, I get it, but like, if you can go to epic.com directly and go buy your V-Bucks and get a bonus because it's cheaper on your website, why didn't Epic just do that? Yeah. I don't understand why. Like, if I want to pay through Apple and and you put the cost on me, it's my choice.
Yeah.
And I know when they offer, Epic's got this virtual currency called V-Bucks for Fortnite. If they offer to the website with a bonus, people are going to just go and buy it there. So I don't know what the big deal was. And I do get that Apple puts a huge tax on developers. But they've also, I mean, to be fair, part of what Epic did and others is actually push Apple down to quite a reasonable rate for small developers. I think 15% now for the first $1 million in sales a year, which is fine.
That's great.
I think it's okay. And so I think we're in an okay place. It's not ideal. Crypto is a problem, obviously, because of the tax and crypto, but we'll see how that plays out in general. Okay, so you're not running this team. Tell me about some of the crazy stuff that happened in Apple during this period, while you're managing this, 400-person team.
Yeah, it's curious when you run a team that large, and they're all largely straight out of the Apple stores, right? So they've never worked in corporate America before. And so they didn't know what behaviors were allowed and not allowed. So we had a lot of really strange stuff. People moving into the building, right? Moving into the office, sleeping under their desks, showering in our showers, right? I made sure that our office was completely self-contained. So you could do everything from that office. But the downside of doing that, and we fed them breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I had food there for everybody because these are all hourly workers, right? All the reviewers are hourly workers. The managers are salaried, but the workers themselves. So they got paid OT, right? When you get overtime, you don't want them to leave the office. You want to keep them there. So we fed them. And in doing that, people moved in. People would sleep under their desk. They're not allowed to. And whenever we found them, we'd have to bust them. So then they moved out to the parking lot, started sleeping in their cars. And it was just stuff like this over and over again. But some of the really weird stuff was that we noticed that when you look at the numbers, right? Now, I looked at numbers every day. When you'd see on certain days of the week, we had more reviewers than ever in the office. Yet our productivity, our apps that we reviewed went down. But you have record numbers of people in the office. You have to figure out what the hell's going on in that office. So
I'm too afraid to ask.
I had one of the managers sneak in, and he said there was one cube that had turned into a DJ booth. They were spinning music. People were dancing. And another another cube turned into the bar. That's where they were serving the booze. And it was just a party. And it turned out this was going on for weeks without my team ever noticing. And it was me having to dig through the numbers to figure out why are my costs rising, but my productivity is lowering. I mean, I hit the roof. And when I found out the next day that the team was basically doing a giant party every night, we had to kind of trim some fat there and deal with it. It was tough because some of the people doing that are your top performers.
Yeah.
And this is the way they blow off steam. And that's great. Just don't bill us for it.
Yeah.
Right. I'm fine with it.
Okay. Well, That's
That's
crazy. I'm sure you're sparing us the gory details. Yeah.
Oh, there's worse ones. Look, sexting on company phones, and you see the office behind them, and it was just sloppy. I mean, if you're gonna do stuff like this, clean up the device, delete the photos, get them
Yeah.
off our iCloud, right? Because it's all shared by the team, and so as soon as you start doing that, it spreads, and suddenly you see nude photos that are and look that ruins marriages and things like that. It was just overall really weird stuff. But some of the funnier ones were the smells, right? So we ran a team that supported 139 different languages, right? So if you think about the size of the App Store, we supported 53 countries, 139 languages. I had teams. I had reviewers that were polyglots. They could read, write, and speak 9, 10 languages. And but for the most part, we would group the Vietnamese review team, the Chinese review team. We'd put them all in these areas, and some of the funny things were like we had the Persian reviewers next to the Turkish reviewers, and on the other side were the Greek reviewers, and they'd all fight. They'd fight all the time, just like they were back in their country. And then they'd always say at the end, whether it was the Greeks or the Iranians, they would just curse out the Turks. That under their breath, they'd say something about the Turks, and you're just like, and the Turks would just laugh, and it was just very much everybody was grouped by region what they were supporting, and then there were scattering of the U.S. reviewers everywhere. But having that there, you get these border conflicts, just like in the real life. But some of the funnier ones were the food smells, right? People would freak out. We had one reviewer, a Vietnamese reviewer, who put fish sauce on her oatmeal every morning.
What?
Now, I'm sure you've tried fish sauce, right? I don't know
Not
if
on
you've-
oatmeal.
No, never on oatmeal. I mean, I would never put on,
Yeah.
but it makes some of the most nasty smells I've ever heard.
my
I've
gosh.
never smelled in my life. And so things like that, and then you get battles brewing about that. People yelling, "Oh, the curry smell is too strong." This happened all the time because when you have a team that big and
And
we're
young.
young,
Yeah.
and you're there for, look, the team worked amazing hours, 14, 15 hours a day often. Yeah, tempers flare, you border disputes, culture disputes in general. That was some of the more interesting stuff.
Oh, interesting. So, Philip, what do you think of the new Apple Vision Pro headset glasses? What do you want to call them?
Yeah, I've been a big advocate of virtual reality since I put together some of my first displays and other things in 1992, 93, right? These were amazing devices. And I always thought there'd be an amazing use for it. In the original early days, I thought it'd be great for doing database access, et cetera. I've thrown that out the window. That's ridiculous, right? But the idea of being able to immerse yourself into a metaverse, into a different world, I think is one of the key big pieces here. But the other one is the augmented reality piece. To overlay content on top of my real world view, I think is some of the more interesting aspects of these headsets. Now, a big user of the MetaQuest, but I find after 30, 40 minutes, I get my eyes hurt, and maybe I get a headache, etc. It's that infinite optics, right? That nobody's really nailed. Apparently, Apple's nailed it. I haven't played with the headset.
I've heard that as well. I've had friends who've used it, and they've said it's been nailed. Because I have the same problem with MetaQuest as well. I mean, it's actually pretty good.
Yeah.
I got the new MetaQuest 3, and it's pretty good. But after 20, 30 minutes, I'm like, oh, my eyes are taking strain. And so it doesn't have the longevity for me to
Right.
keep going.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, I still put these into a bucket of they're going to be great to have fun with, right?
Yeah.
They're going to be like my Quest. I love it. I played zombie games and things like that, and it feels like I'm there. I get the hair raising on the back of my head when
I
somebody's
was playing the
attacking me.
Iron Man game, the Iron Man
Yeah.
VR game, and I was like floating and flying, and then I was actually getting a little bit of like vertigo, like whoa, I was getting off balance. there. So
Right.
it's very real. It's very real compared to the VR games when I was a kid growing up. It's like, I mean, I was a huge fan of the Lawnmower Man. I watched that. I played the game. I liked the whole VR thing. This is next level. This is I didn't expect to see this in my lifetime.
And the Apple one is bringing it
the
to
next level.
Next level.
Well, it's like Apple. I think would be it was like 2007, right? Nokia was BlackBerry, rather, I
Yes,
should say.
that's right.
BlackBerry, Nokia was bigger in South Africa, but BlackBerry was the standard. Everyone used BlackBerry, and no one thought you could get something better until Apple brought out the iPhone. It's
That's
kind of
right.
the same thing right now because besides MetaQuest, you've got a whole bunch of other headsets. I think Steam's got one, Microsoft's
Yes.
got the HoloLens, et cetera, et cetera. And Apple's just coming over the top and putting out a trump card.
Apple's really good at looking at an existing market
Mm.
and saying, "Oh, we can create so much better products," right? And they did that. They did that with the
Uncompromisingly
iPad.
better.
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so I think we're going to find that. Look, I think the sensors that are built into that
Mhm.
headset are just they blow me away. They're going to be able to track so much information about you as
Mm.
you're using it. They're probably going to be able to sense if your eyes are starting to get fatigued and be
Yeah.
able to change the lighting and change the optics a bit. It's an amazing device. But look, it's still super highly priced.
Mhm.
It's expensive. And so we're not gonna see millions of people buying them the first year. There'll be probably a couple 100,000
But that's
sold.
fine because the next
That's
year the
great.
price will drop 50% probably.
That's right. And the device will get
It gets
smaller.
smaller, and the year after it'll drop another 50%. So eventually, I think they probably get it down to $1,500.
Yeah, I think so
I think
too.
they're going to launch at 3,500. I think within 2-3 years you'll have one for 1,500, and maybe. I mean, this is the market that Meta's going after the Quest is more the Android style market, like the cheaper, lower end market.
Right.
Apple's coming with a premium product.
Yeah, exactly. But do you see this Quest is like I mean the new Apple Vision going the Apple TV route, which is small numbers, or are we going to see more like an iPhone where it gradually just hockey sticks?
No, I think it goes. I think it goes hockey stick. I think it actually is gonna. It's gonna cross the divide. I think this is the next big compute platform. Even for my company, Rumi, we're working on allowing you to use your Apple Vision Pro avatar in your
Yeah.
meeting. So you can have a meeting with virtual and real people in the meeting. So someone can be using the Vision Pro. They can see you, but you see this representation of themselves, and that's fine because some people just don't want to be, physically on camera, and so we're going to be pushing the envelope with that.
I love that. See, to me, at identity.com, right, we focus on a lot of the Web3 needs, and a lot of them is to allow pseudonymity, right?
Yeah.
So the idea that you could interview someone and work with someone and never knowing their gender or what they really look like because they're using avatars for everything, I think it sounds like an ideal type of thing to have. So if you can have that technology
Yeah.
with the Vision and with Rumi, it'd be amazing.
Yeah, I think with avatars, there's a very interesting evolution that needs to occur there. I think we're going to go from real people to lifelike representations, and so MetaQuest just did something with Lex Fridman had showed an example what him and Zuckerberg did this sort of in the metaverse conversation. Looked pretty good, very similar to what Apple's doing with the Vision Pro. And I think we first moved towards these very lifelike representations of ourselves, and once we're comfortable with that, then we can start moving to I identify as an elephant and
Yes.
have a trunk and want to sit on a chat. Like I just don't think we get there. I don't think the leap is going from real humans to animal avatars anytime soon. I think we have to go through the human like representation, and because these goggles track your voice, your facial expressions, and it projects on the screen, it looks very lifelike and real.
It's
But,
amazing.
I think it's great.
I think you're totally right about the avatars. In 2008, IBM decided that they were going to hold future press conferences in Second Life.
Yeah.
If you remember this.
Yeah, I remember that.
And I jumped on Second Life. It's like, I want to see this press conference. So I was running developer relations for an AI company. It's like, hey, this might be the future. Let me see. And I was in there, and most people just have these simple plain avatars, and then comes in a dragon, and then someone comes in, a lady comes in with everything exposed, and you're just like, where am I? What's going on here? This is a business meeting, and there's all these naked people and others. It's jarring, right,
Yeah.
to see that. So I think you're right. We have to transition there slowly until you identify as an elephant. Yeah.
Okay, so Philip, so you built the App Store from 4 people to 400, and Apple was in full swing 2016, and you decided to leave. Why did you leave?
Yeah, I left. I finally got review times down to 1 day. Right.
Okay.
That was my goal from the very beginning. From when it was 3 weeks when I started to get it down to 1 day was just life was better. But look, it wasn't just about that. People like Jaws would always joke that I had the hardest job at Apple. Right. This was coming from somebody who'd been there a long time, because if I approved the wrong app, I'd get yelled at internally, and if I rejected the wrong app, I'd get yelled at internally and externally, right? People were just always on me. I had people once, I got outed in an interesting way. My position at Apple was a confidential position in the early days. I made the mistake of taking a phone call with a developer and his boss, which was David Copperfield, the magician. Right? I was on this call, and they explained to me what they wanted to do with their app, and I realized my team had it all wrong. This wasn't a trick app; it was an illusion app. The person that buys the app knows full well what it's about. It's not trying to trick the buyer of the app; it's the buyer uses it on their friends, and so. My team was saying this bait and switch. It's not doing what it's saying. It absolutely was doing. So I told David Copperfield, I said, we'll approve your app. You'll get it approved in the morning. And he went out on Twitter and he said, thanks to Phillip Shoemaker, the head of the App Store, blah, blah. That changed, that turned my life upside down. That's one tweet.
You got doxxed.
I got doxxed. And it was painful.
You got doxxed by David Copperfield.
Of all people, right? I don't go around showing people how his illusions work, why he did that. So I started getting death threats. I found people would find my house and knock on my door at night
to get the app approved.
To get their app approved,
wow.
or subtle threats or subtle bribery. Right? People tried to bribe to get their app in the store. They tried to threaten me to get their app in the store. They'd wait for me by my car. I was always one of the last people to leave the office late at night. My car was sitting in the parking lot, and somebody would be standing by it at 11 o'clock at night.
Yeah,
and you'd be walking out like nervous. People would tailgate, right? People would sit and tailgate, right? So they'd follow an Apple employee through because they badge in, and security would find them and pull them out and send me pictures of their car, right? Here's the contents of that person's car, because Apple had rights to do that because they were parked on their parking lot. And so I'd get all these really weird messages, but the death threats, so many death threats, credible ones in Brazil, credible ones in Australia. Someone named Chopper Reed, a famous, somebody said, oh, he's a celebrity mass murderer out of Australia. It's like, I don't even know how that goes together.
What the hell is a celebrity mass murderer?
Exactly. Well, he threatened me and said, if you ever come to Australia, I'll kill you. And I talked to Apple Legal and Apple Security, and they said, yeah, it's credible. That's Chopper Reed. Eric Bana did a movie about him, right? And where he played Chopper Reed. I don't know who the guy is, but I didn't go to Australia. And those things were just getting too much for me.
Is he in
all
jail
of those.
in Australia?
Chopper Reed is no longer. He passed away.
Okay,
last
so
few years.
you can go.
So
You
I
can
can go to Australia now. I'm thinking of going this year. So now that I found that out, but it was all the death threats. And look, I finally got it down to one day. It was so much stress. I mean, those meetings every week. I was just like, I'm done. I've done what I needed to accomplish here. And quite frankly, other things were calling my name, right? Blockchain was really interesting to me in 2016. I was like, it's going to be big in the future. So I left Apple, went to, my wife and I went to Dominican Republic to kite surf for a while. And then we just kind of found our way into crypto.
Wow. That's I mean, you took on quite a martyr's job at Apple, if you think about it, and to leave under those circumstances, yeah. But I mean, sometimes you just need a change, right? You were
That's
there
right.
for a long time, so you just need a change. And then this is around about the time we met.
That's right.
So 2017, 2018 era, a mutual friend introduced us, and I was working on Civic, blockchain-based identity. We were setting up a nonprofit foundation to try and further the use of digital identities in a way that is responsible for data privacy and the like for consumers. And we were looking for someone who could run the foundation. And so you now are sitting in identity.com, which is a nonprofit foundation.
That's right. It was such an interesting story, right? The way I met you is because I called up our friend, said, I'm thinking of going this company or this company. They both made me offers.
Yeah.
And he's like, you got to talk to Vinny. Vinny's on the board of one of those. He knows both companies really well. Talk to him. In fact, the other company was one of your previous co-founders, right?
Yeah.
And his company. And so I went. We had mochi muffins at that coffee shop.
Yep. It was the what was it?
The robot one, yeah.
Cafe X, I think. Or
Yes, that's right. I think
Cafe
that's right.
X on Market Street.
On Market Street, yeah.
It's just, for those who have been to San Francisco, it was, I don't know, not sure they're still there, but you could walk in there and swipe your credit card, select what you want, latte, and the robot just makes it for you. It was awesome.
It was awesome.
And the muffins were great. The
The
mochi,
muffins- mochi
best
muffins.
mochi muffins ever.
Best. And so we sat down and I wanted to pick your brain about these two companies and you gave me some good advice and you're like, how about this instead?
You know, the funny thing is when I met with you, I had no I was just, we hadn't really even formalized a job spec or anything. We were just
Yeah.
like, it was one of those like, we have to get this done at some point in time, reasonably soon. And then as I was listening to you, I'm like, wait, you've got a lot of experience working with developers and whatever else. And then, so I threw it out to you and you decided to join and run the foundation.
That's right. It was fun.
That's great. And you've been there ever since now. And so
Been there ever
do
since.
you want to give us an update where you are, where identity.com is and how people can reach out to you or work with you on it?
Absolutely. I think the key thing about identity.com is the very first thing we started working on were decentralized identifiers, DIDs, right? And these are Web3 specifically. There has to be an attestation on the blockchain. There has to be something in a wallet, et cetera. And this really is a very technically, it's a very technically difficult thing to do, right? And it's technically difficult to use. Right? DIDs are difficult to use. You have to store keys and all that. Same thing with a crypto wallet. And so you find that the reach is pretty small. But we did that. We worked on DIDs for the Gateway Protocol, something that Civic uses, and a few other partners are using it, and that's great. We're doing a big port to Binance right now, a Binance chain support. But at the same time, right around the time FTX and SBF died, we decided, well, why don't we take a step back? Let's work on some more of the fundamentals, verifiable credentials, right? VCs are still a cryptographically signed, encrypted form of my identity, and I can ultimately use that. I don't have to have anything on the blockchain. It can be separate. I can use that in the Web 2 space. I can use that in real world events, et cetera. And so that's what we've been focusing on this past year is writing some tools to do verifiable credentials to be able to allow us to use your identity, reuse your identity for things like gambling websites, alcohol,
even porn websites, right? So
exactly.
Just because if you can prove you're over 18, it actually protects kids if this person is over 18 going to the website.
And I love that idea, right? And I know that people struggle with the freedom of the internet.
Yeah.
Kids should be able to have access to whatever they want online. But you've seen what there is available
Within
online
limits,
with just a
within
few
limits.
keystrokes, right?
I mean,
You
even
get extreme stuff.
When
And-
I was 18 years old, I was at university and someone told me about like rotten.com. And I'm like, oh, what is that? It's a website. I'm like, okay. So I typed it in. I closed it within like 3 seconds and I saw the most disgusting things of it. And I had no idea what I was going
Right?
to. It was back in the early days, 97 or something. And
Yeah. Well, do you remember the first time? I don't know if you ever went to whitehouse.com. I thought that would be, of course, you're new to the internet. You're like, I'm going to see what the president, I hear the president has a website, Bill Clinton. And you're like, whitehouse.com. Oh no, it's whitehouse.gov. Whitehouse.com brought you to a full
One side.
porn site. And
Yeah.
it was just, you're like, oh great, I'm in the office.
There's definitely need to protect kids. And so digital identity, making it available online, reduces fraud, improves who has access to what.
Yeah.
And, and doing it in a way that's decentralized means that there's no sort of single government database with everyone's information. I mean, the
That's
biggest risk the world faces at some point, we're all in one database with one government. And as long as we can fight against that, I think that's part of the vision, yeah.
Yeah, for me, I think when I talk about the story about how people were able to track down my home address and they get that's all because of the Equifax leak.
Yeah.
I believe that's why. I think you and I both did similar things where we bought our own identities off the dark web to see if we really could. And that to me, knowing that there's these honeypots of information that aren't properly secured, that are out there that hackers can get access to, and in one hack get millions of data points about millions of people, which just blew my mind.
$20 for a driver's license.
It's insane.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's insane. So that's what I wanted to focus on was let's get a world where there's no honeypots and where you don't have to disclose everything. Look, in the future, if you have to go prove that you're over 18 to a porn website, would you rather use a decentralized identifier
Yep. Or your
that
driver's
gives no
license or
information about
passport?
you or your driver's license? I don't trust
Yeah.
porn sites to store any information on me, right? In a way that's secure. So I'd rather use a DID or a VC.
Yeah. Well, people want to work on that project with you and trying to connect to identity.com, as the name suggests. It's
That's right.
Identity.com. Okay, let's move on. If you could change one thing in your career, what would it be and why?
Oh, I'll tell you, arrogance is the thing that I would change if I had to change the way I performed in certain things. Is like when I was at Palm, I had a large engineering group working on all the development tools for everything, but I thought I knew everything, right? And so when people would come to bring advice from outside the team, advice how to run the team, et cetera, I was too arrogant to take it on, and I think that was one of the big things that I struggled with early on. At Apple, I got more of a humble demeanor. I felt I had to learn. That's all I could do. So for me, what I've learned in life is that you should always be learning. And the arrogance of in my career at Palm, I think really hamstrung me for a while.
Yeah, it's a great lesson. Yeah, I think keeping your ego in check for everyone is good, except Steve.
That's right.
What's the one area of personal growth you're currently focusing on?
Yeah, right now it's an interesting time. Is that for me? I've always struggled. Look, I'm an engineer at heart. I love being behind a keyboard. This is one of the beauties about email and Twitter, and that you can just interact how you like there. But it's that whole interacting with customers, interacting with new people, et cetera, that I've always felt squeamish about, right? And so my years at identity.com have had to turn me into a business development person. And if you're doing BD and sales, you can't be squeamish about meeting new people. You got to get yourself out there. And so for me, it's just always working on that. And look, COVID didn't help.
No.
Right? COVID, I was shut away in my house for a long time. We'd see each other once in a while.
Yeah, we were hermits.
That's right. But it was tough, right?
Yeah.
Because then you had to get back out there and meet people, and you're like, people, I don't want anything to do with
Don't
them. They'll
shake
give me a
anyone's hands.
disease. I don't want. And so that was for me. It's all about getting more comfortable working with people, and that's what I've been working on.
And learning new set of skills. Okay, we're gonna go into some rapid fire questions now. What's your favorite book, article, podcast recommendation? What do you recommend people?
Well, I think my favorite book is How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan, right?
Great book.
Michael Pollan's a great writer. I read all of his Soul of a Chef,
I
Mind
actually
of a
have it up
Chef. You do? I love that book
That's a
because
great book.
Michael Pollan is somebody that you would just not expect to write a book like that,
Yeah.
and it just blew my mind.
Really fascinating. Okay, what's your go-to habit that you think everybody should implement in their daily routine?
Exercise.
Exercise.
To me, it's running. I run every single day without fail now.
Okay, great advice. What's the best bit of financial advice you ever received?
Tired. Listen to Vinny. I've had better success listening to your tips than anything I could ever give
I'm
somebody.
not always right, but yeah, it's been a
Look,
pretty good track record.
Exactly, you got a great track record, and to me that helps a lot. And look, I'm say that only partially facetiously, but look to people that you respect, that are doing well in the financial, and get advice from them rather than try to figure it out all on your own, because it's not going to work.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, what's a common misconception about business or life that you'd like to set the record straight on?
Common misconception about business or life. All right, so about business, I and you probably disagree with me. To me, I've always hated this idea of that, like, just get the users, you'll figure out how to monetize later. I found that didn't work in the App Store. That doesn't work, has never worked in any business. To me, you absolutely have to focus on monetization up front, figure it out, rather than just try to acquire users.
I think it's partially true. I think in some cases it doesn't apply, but some cases it definitely does apply. I think we also over-index on Google, because Google did that, right? They got this huge base of people searching Google, and then they monetize afterwards. Funny enough that ChatGPT was kind of free in the beginning, and they started charging, but they charged very early on, and they built a huge business doing that. So you are right, and even with my company, Rumi, we basically, it's been free for the better part of this year, but we're going to start charging from the 1st of January or maybe even sooner. And you have to monetize, because if people aren't willing to pay for the product and just use it for free, you can't really build a great business, because you have these costs and you have to keep relying on investors putting money in. So I'm with you 100%. I think it's more about when do you start monetizing. But
makes sense.
But I think that we probably both agree that monetize as early as possible is probably the right way to go.
Yeah.
Okay, last question. If you could go back in time and meet one person in history, living or dead, who would it be?
Yeah, it's interesting. To me, it always goes to Einstein, Albert Einstein. I'm such an admirer of his
Mm,
work. I've read everything that he wrote. I'm a huge, huge fan, and it's not about the science.
mm.
To me, I think he had a brilliant philosophy. He was very
Yeah,
philosophical.
I liked his philosophies.
Yeah,
My favorite one was, was it two things are infinite: human stupidity and the universe.
that's right.
And I'm not so sure about the latter or the former, whatever how he phrased it. But
Loved his
yeah,
book.
and I loved. Did you watch Oppenheimer?
I did.
What did you think?
I thought it was really good.
Yeah.
It was really long.
It's way too
It
long.
was so
It was
long.
way too long.
It was tough. And look, the way Nolan always does that whole
Mm.
back and forth, and you have these flashbacks that I had to sit there at times and say, okay,
Which era are we
which
in?
era
right
am
now?
I in right
Yeah,
now?
yeah,
But then you kind of see about the color and the
yeah.
photography. It's once I picked up on those cues, I thought it was really brilliant.
Yeah.
But I need to go see it twice.
Yeah, but I think I don't think I have the time for that one.
No, exactly.
Philip, thank you for being here. Really great having you. And I think wish you all the best with identity.com. Obviously, I think it's really great what you're building out there.
Thanks, Vinny.
Thanks,
Thanks for
man.
having me.
You too.